Yeah, I mean, look, I think everybody knows that why we announced it that way then. Yeah, it's not my preference. My preference is always you hear nothing and then one day the game is out. Like there's an announcement and the game is out. Like that's my perfect scenario.
Todd Howard's been talking about the Elder Scrolls 6 again. Which means it's officially that time of the year, the annual Hope and Cope. Surely this year we'll get an announcement, a release date, something, right? Alas, if history's taught me anything, probably not. But at this point, it's part of the ritual. But instead of sitting here sulking and rewatching this goddamn clip, I figured I would talk about the game. Maybe it'll help me get something off my chest. Consider this an Elder Scrolls therapy session. And perfect timing, because we ran a poll this week, and pretty overwhelmingly, the subscribers wanted to see me talk about my ideal Elder Scrolls game. Meaning, what do we want to see in the next Elder Scrolls? What we don't want to see. And instead of turning this into some giant fantasy wish list where we just throw features at the wall and see what sticks, I want to approach it a little bit differently. We're going to treat this like we're actually designing the Elder Scrolls. I'm going to lay out some of the core design pillars I care the most about in an Elder Scrolls 6 game, and break down my do's and don'ts. Hopefully we can scream into the void long enough to not get another Fallout 76 or Starfield. For each pillar, we'll talk through what direction I'd push for and what direction I would stay away from. I will say my goal is to stay somewhat grounded. I don't want to create some impossible dream project, but a version of Elder Scrolls 6 that could realistically exist and be a worthy Skyrim successor. But there is a lot riding on this game. Bethesda is in a strange spot right now. There's been a lot of noise over the last few years. Some of it is earned, and to be honest, a little bit of it is exaggerated, but it is there. Fallout 76 was a train wreck. Starfield has divided people, and even if you like those games, there's no denying it's been a long time since Skyrim. Long enough that expectations have grown massive. Whether it's fair or not, the Elder Scrolls 6 carries the weight of generations of RPGs. People want it to feel like the next leap forward. Maybe that will restore our confidence in Bethesda and Todd, but probably not. Anyway, instead of spiraling into hyper-cynicism, let's slow it down and let's talk design. If this game is going to succeed, what does it actually need to prioritize? So here are the 6 pillars that we're going to prioritize and kind of break down what we want to see. First, we're going to talk about world design and setting. If the foundation isn't strong, nothing else really matters. Second, exploration. Not just a big map, but how we actually move through it and discover everything. Third is player agency and consequence. If our choices don't shape anything, then we're just tourists. Fourth is character identity. Who we are in this world needs to feel distinct, not just a jack of all trades. Fifth is combat. It doesn't need to be a Souls-like, but it does need to evolve a little. And sixth, writing and quests. Because at the end of the day, if they write the next great American novel, I'm not just going to make paper airplanes with it. Pillar 1 is world design and setting. And this is the foundation. If this doesn't work, nothing else we talk about really matters. You can have great combat, great quests, whatever, but if the world itself doesn't scratch our Elder Scrolls itch, it's all for nothing. First off, I do want this to be a big world. They've had a long time to make this game, a very long time. And I know scale is scary for BGS fans after Starfield, but it shouldn't be. Surely after 15 years and quintupling the staff, we can have a bigger, denser world than Skyrim. I think that's reasonable. A while back, there were leaks that pointed to Valenwood, and at the time I actually thought this sounded credible. But after the teaser trailer we got in 2018, I don't think we're going to Valenwood. The general consensus is Hammerfell or High Rock, and I think that's probably where we're going to land. If it's between the two, I'd personally lean Hammerfell. And honestly, if we're talking the ideal scenario, I think the best version of the game is one that gives us both, or at least the Iliac Bay region, so we can get some crossover. Maybe that would be a sweet spot. Hammerfell just has a way better range in my opinion, if we had to pick between the two. You've got deserts, jungles, steppes, rocky coasts, ancient Redguard cities, pirates, political tensions with the Empire, and the Thalmor angle. There's so much variety there. High Rock is cool, don't get me wrong, but it leans more into the traditional medieval fantasy of mountains, highlands, and castles. It's strong thematically, but it's a lot more familiar. I think Hammerfell feels a lot fresher, and the setting to me needs to feel fresh. As long as I love Skyrim, I'm ready for something new. Graphically, I'm not that worried. Starfield, even though I didn't love it as a game, has some genuinely beautiful environments. Bethesda knows how to make landscapes look good at this point, so graphically, I'm not very concerned. What I'm more concerned about is how they build the world underneath that. We need to be real, procedural generation is going to be a part of it. That's just reality. It's a part of modern development. It's not evil or automatically bad. Skyrim used procedural tools, and a lot of great games do. The problem that I've covered many times on this channel is when they replace or generate points of interest. If you're going to give me large open spaces, that's fine. Deserts should feel vast or steppes should feel open. That makes sense. But those spaces do also need human polish as well. And not just that, they need authored landmarks, real points of interest that feel placed with intention. Not just terrain with something generated plopped in the middle of it. It totally ruins the whole experience. In Starfield, there's so many times that I just came across this same exact point of interest, and I just totally lost all joy in exploration. When spaces between things start feeling like filler and not something I'm actually exploring, it totally kills Bethesda games for me. And on that note, immersion is actually core to this pillar. Skyrim did something really well where when you were in Whiterun Hold or the Rift, you actually could tell. If you show me any screenshot anywhere in Skyrim, I could probably tell you which hold it's in. And on that note, the cities were also designed really well. Solitude and Windhelm are completely different, but both are designed very well. Actually, all of the major cities, for that matter, I actually thoroughly enjoyed. We've done tons of tier lists on this videos, and I might talk bad about some of the major cities, but at the end of the day, they're all outstanding. The way they use the architecture, the tone, and politics to really reinforce that you're somewhere specific is done so well in Skyrim. So if we're in High Rock, I need to feel that I'm in High Rock constantly. Knightly orders and Breton politics, trade cities and feudal rivalries. It should bleed into the streets. And just as similarly, if we're in Hammerfell, I need to lean into Redguard culture hard. Clothing, curved swords, Yakutan history, the way the cities are laid out, the way the temples look. Don't sand it down into generic fantasy so it's broadly marketable. Commit to it. I think that's a big thing that made Skyrim and Morrowind specifically so great from a world design perspective, is locking into the specific vibe and making you feel like you are in that world. And then there's the timeline. I really hope this is after Skyrim, but not too far after Skyrim. I don't want a massive time skip and we get some book or codex explaining, well, this is how the Thalmor fought, and this is kind of the resolution of that situation. Now we're doing something completely unrelated and carry on. No. To me, the Thalmor thread is one of the most compelling arcs they've ever set up in an Elder Scrolls game. And there's so much unfinished business. A second Hammerfell Thalmor war is super interesting, and it feels grounded in what I'm already invested in. Let this game feel connected, almost like a continuation of Skyrim. I know that's not typically how the Elder Scrolls does it, but that's what I really, really want. World design isn't just about map size, it's about setting and cultures and how much we get to live in the world. If they get this right and the world is immersive and cohesive, then everything else we talk about has something already great to stand on. And if they get this wrong, at least I'll get to make a video about it. Alright, and Pillar 2 is exploration. And this one is huge for Elder Scrolls games because exploration is the reason most of us fell in love with these games in the first place. It's not really the main quest, it's definitely not the combat, it's wandering in a random direction and finding something cool and unique. Skyrim absolutely nailed this in a lot of ways. The amount of times I left a city planning to go somewhere specific, and 20 minutes later I was crawling through a random dungeon halfway across the map is staggering. But what I don't want to see is exploration turning into checklists. One of the biggest mistakes of some modern open world games is turning the map into a grocery list. Icons everywhere, activities everywhere, every location revealed before you even get there. Exploration is something that needs to happen organically. If there's mechanics to force it, it generally, for me at least, falls flat. Bethesda has mostly avoided this problem in the past, and I really hope that they're able to keep it that way. I want to find places naturally, through rumors or NPC dialogue. It could be stumbling across something while wandering, not because the game decided to throw a marker on my compass from a half mile away and says, go do this activity. Another thing I really want is for locations themselves to hone in on environmental storytelling. In Skyrim, you could walk into a dungeon and there would actually be a story happening there. Maybe it was a bandit hideout that used to be a Nord tomb, maybe it was a necromancer experiment gone wrong, or maybe it was a Dwemer ruin with some kind of weird mechanical nonsense happening underground. Even when the general themes repeated, the specific context still made each one interesting. And I think that's actually what made BGS games special. And that's where procedural stuff becomes dangerous again. If the world is full of places that feel generated instead of authored, exploration stops being exciting. You start recognizing patterns and dungeons start to feel like busy work. Another thing I'd really like to see them lean into is vertical exploration. Elder Scrolls maps are at their best when the terrain itself becomes part of the journey. Mountains, cliffs, coastal cities, or ruins carved into the faces of rocks. Places that make you think, how the hell am I going to get up there? Maybe I shouldn't have to jump backwards up a mountain is all I'm saying. That moment when you finally reach a place you spotted from miles away is one of the most satisfying parts of these games. And honestly, I'd love if they were a little less generous with fast travel early on. Not removing it entirely, but encouraging players to move through the world first. Let people learn the roads, discover landmarks, and understand geography before they teleport everywhere. I think this is a put your money where your mouth is design. If the exploration is good, I shouldn't mind walking around early, even though I'm sure this would be the first thing modded out when the creation kit drops. Now there's another thing I want to talk about here, because there's a rumor floating around that the Elder Scrolls 6 might have ships. And the idea is that you'll be able to build your own ship and sail around the Iliac Bay, exploring islands and different coastal regions. And on paper, that sounds cool, but honestly, I don't really want that. Starfield had a spaceship system and a lot of people loved it, so I understand why Bethesda would look at that and think, okay, let's bring that into Elder Scrolls 6. But to me, that feels like the kind of system that could easily overtake the game in the wrong way. Exploration in the Elder Scrolls should happen on foot. The core loop should always be leaving a city, heading somewhere on the map, and getting completely distracted along the way. Seeing something on the horizon and deciding to check it out, or finding a cave that you didn't expect. Occasionally running into NPC events, or suddenly realizing after 2 hours have passed you never made it to where you originally set out to go. That's the magic. If the main exploration loop becomes sailing around a giant bay, docking at procedurally generated islands, and triggering random encounters, that's a completely different experience. And honestly, I just don't trust Bethesda to build a system like that without turning it into the primary way you move throughout the world. Also, for everyone who enjoyed Starfield's shipbuilding, ask yourself this. How much did you enjoy exploring space in your ship? Is that what you want the primary driver of exploration to be in the Elder Scrolls 6? Me, personally, that's not what I think the Elder Scrolls 6 should be. Another thing I don't want to see come back is the settlement system. I know some people loved it, but for the Elder Scrolls, it just doesn't fit the same way. More importantly, it gives developers an excuse to leave huge parts of the map empty. You end up with these big open spaces where nothing really happens, and the justification is, well, you can just build something there. No, I'd much rather see a return to the Hearthfire approach. A few specific locations where you can build something meaningful, maybe a house or a castle, maybe a stronghold tied to a faction in the region. But it should exist within the world, not replace parts of the world. Exploration should be about discovering places that already exist, not filling empty land that developers left behind. At the end of the day, exploration in Elder Scrolls is about curiosity. It's about the feeling that there's always something interesting over that next hill. If they can preserve that feeling, everything else in the game gets better automatically. Alright, Pillar 3 is player agency and consequence. This is one of those areas where Elder Scrolls games have drifted a bit over time, but they've kind of never really been that strong. If you really think about it though, what makes an RPG feel like an RPG is the idea that your character actually matters, your choices actually matter, and the way you move through the world changes to how you respond. And if we're being honest, Skyrim didn't do the best job at that. It actually did a very poor job at that. You could become the Archmage of the College of Winterhold and not even cast a single spell. You could lead the Companions, run the Thieves Guild, serve the Dark Brotherhood, and still walk into a major city and be treated like just another random traveler. The game is fun, I'm not saying that. I'm a huge Skyrim fan. But the world didn't really react to the fact that you were basically running half of the institutions in Skyrim, and there wasn't any friction. And friction is important in RPGs, because if the game lets you do everything all at the same time, then your choices start to lose weight. Being able to join every faction, solve every quest line the same way, and end up in charge of everything sounds great on paper, but what it actually does in practice is flattens your character. You stop being a specific person in the world and you become this kind of universal protagonist that fits everything. Granted, that's what Elder Scrolls games have been, but I'm hoping in the Elder Scrolls 6 we push back against that just a little bit. If I join a faction, it should mean something. If I align myself with a particular group or philosophy, other groups should react to that. Maybe they would distrust me, shut certain doors, or offer different opportunities depending on which side I chose. On first thought, not being able to go to Solitude because I'm a Stormcloak might make you think that the game would feel smaller, but to me I actually think it makes it feel way deeper, because suddenly different playthroughs start to feel different. In Skyrim, the only thing that differentiated playthroughs was your build and what you chose to do. And hell, some of us ran the same build over and over. I know I did. And if you played your playthrough long enough, you did all of the same quest lines. So by the end, all of your playthroughs end up being the same. Another thing that would help here is a little simple recognition from the world itself. If I spent 50 hours doing something that affected a region, people should start acknowledging that. NPCs should know who I am. Not every random villager needs to be praising me, but if I change the fate of a town or take part in a major event, it shouldn't feel like the world immediately forgets about that. I shouldn't get shit-talked by random guards after I save the city is all I'm saying. Skyrim did have moments of this, but it was pretty light. You'd become the Dragonborn and a few guards would comment on it, but it didn't change much. In The Elder Scrolls 6, it would be really cool if your actions slowly reshape the environment around you. Maybe a town that you help defend starts to grow. Maybe a faction that you supported becomes more visible in the region. Or maybe a rival group starts causing problems somewhere else because you did something earlier. Little ripples like that can make the world feel alive without needing massive branching storylines. Because that's the other thing. Not every decision needs to explode into something huge and alternate. Sometimes the best consequences are the smaller ones that show up hours later. Maybe someone you helped in the game shows up again later with new information. Maybe a political choice changes the leadership of a city, or maybe a conflict that you ignored gets way worse over time. Those kind of delayed reactions make the world feel persistent, and persistence is what makes agency feel more believable. Another thing that would help a lot is allowing players to approach quests in different ways. Not every problem needs one single clean solution. If I'm playing a stealthy character, I should be able to handle situations quietly. If I'm playing a warrior, maybe I solve the same situation with force. Contrarily, if I'm playing somebody who leans into social skills or persuasion, maybe I can avoid the conflict altogether. Those kind of options are what make people feel like their character build actually matters. At the end of the day, player agency isn't just about picking dialogue options. It's about feeling like the world bends even slightly based on what you chose to become inside of it. If I spend hundreds of hours in a world, it shouldn't look the exact same way as it did when I arrived. Something should be different. Some places should change, and some people should be remembering me. That's the promise that RPGs make to players, and if The Elder Scrolls 6 leans into that promise a little harder, it would go a long way towards making the experience feel deeper than we've seen in previous Bethesda games. Alright, Pillar 4 is character identity, and this one is really important to me because it's something that The Elder Scrolls used to do incredibly well, and then over time, it started to drift a little bit. When I say character identity, what I'm really talking about is the feeling that your character is actually a specific kind of person in the world. Someone who has strengths, weaknesses, and playstyles that shape how you interact with the game. Not just a blank slate that slowly becomes good at everything. If you go back to something like Morrowind, your character build mattered a lot. You had a class, you had skills that determined what you were capable of doing, what quests were easier or harder, or even how you interacted with people in certain situations. You weren't just the player, you were the type of character. Over time, Bethesda has moved away from that structure. By the time we got to Skyrim, the philosophy shifted more towards total freedom. No classes, no real restrictions, just level whatever you want and become whatever you want along the way. And while I did enjoy it, and on the surface that sounds great, the idea that you can experiment, try different playstyles, pick up new abilities whenever you want, that flexibility is fun early in a playthrough. But what tends to happen is that eventually your character just becomes good at everything. You start as a warrior, and then you level up a little bit of destruction magic, and then you start sneaking because it's useful. Then suddenly you're casting spells, using bows, sneaking through dungeons, and swinging a sword all in the same character. The game stops asking you to commit to anything. For The Elder Scrolls 6, I really hope we push things slightly back towards specialization. I don't want the player to be locked into a rigid class forever, but I would like it if the game encouraged you to lean into a certain kind of character. If you're building a stealth character, the game should support the path in interesting ways. You should want to play that way. If you're a mage, that experience should feel fundamentally different from someone who built a heavy armor warrior. Right now, those lines tend to blur pretty quickly. A big part of that comes down to skill progression and perks. Skyrim had a lot of cool perks, but most of them ultimately just increase numbers. More damage, more efficiency, or slightly stronger versions of what you were already doing. What I really like to see is perks that change how you play the game, abilities that open up new interactions with the world, or new ways to approach problems. The more your build changes the way you interact with the game, the more your build starts to feel like an identity instead of just a stat sheet or buffs. And gear is another part of this. In a lot of RPGs, the equipment you wear ends up reinforcing the kind of character you're playing. Someone walking around in heavy armor with a massive two-handed weapon sends a very different message than somebody wearing robes covered in arcane symbols. I'd love to see equipment lean harder into that identity, not just stronger armor or better weapons, but gear that supports certain playstyles and subclasses and makes those playstyles feel more distinct. Magic is a big piece of this too. Magic has always been one of the more interesting parts of the Elder Scrolls, but it's also an area with a lot of room for growth. Being a dedicated mage should feel deep enough to carry an entire playthrough, not just a handful of spells that you rotate between. Spellcasting should feel creative, flexible, and like something that lets you play and approach situations in different ways. That same idea applies with every archetype. Warriors should feel powerful and physical, stealth characters should feel clever and deliberate, and hybrid builds should exist too, but they should feel like intentional combinations rather than just someone who leveled everything. At the end of the day, character identity is what makes your version of the game feel different from someone else's. The world might be the same, the quests might be the same, but the way you move through them should feel unique based on the character that you created. If the Elder Scrolls 6 can push that idea a little bit further than Skyrim did, it would add a ton of depth without needing to reinvent an entire formula. Alright, Pillar 5 is combat. And this is one of those topics where Elder Scrolls fans tend to be split into two camps. You've got people who want combat to become something completely different, something closer to the Souls-style system with really tight mechanics and high difficulty. Then you got people who want it to stay basically the same that it's always been. Personally, I think the truth is somewhere in the middle. I don't think the Elder Scrolls needs to turn into Dark Souls. That's not what the game really is about. Combat in the Elder Scrolls has always been more about supporting the role-playing experience than becoming the entire focus of the game. But at the same time, it definitely needs to evolve. If you go back and look at Skyrim's combat, it's pretty simple. Swing your weapon, block sometimes, cast a spell, and repeat. It works, and it's satisfying enough in the early game, but after a while you start to notice that encounters themselves don't change very much. Most of the enemies behave in similar ways. Bandits, draugrs, and animals all kind of run at you and trade hits until somebody falls over. For the Elder Scrolls 6, I'd love to see them add more depth without overcomplicating things. Part of that could just be better enemy behavior. Enemies that react differently depending on what you're doing, enemies that try to flank you, enemies that use the environment, or enemies that fight differently depending on their faction or culture. If you're fighting a group of trained warriors, it should feel different than a bunch of desperate bandits hiding in a cave. Another thing that could really improve combat is encounter variety. One reason combat starts to feel repetitive in a lot of RPGs is because the situations don't change. You're fighting the same kind of enemies in the same kinds of spaces over and over again. But if encounters are designed more thoughtfully, combat suddenly becomes more interesting. Fighting in a narrow ruin corridor should feel different than fighting on a cliffside or inside of a crowded city street. And then of course there's magic again, because magic has always been a huge part of combat in the Elder Scrolls. I would love to see them expand the spell system in ways that create more interactions. Spells that affect the environment, combine with each other, or give players creative options beyond just direct damage. Magic should feel like a toolbox, not just a different kind of weapon. And that same idea applies with melee combat too. It doesn't need to be hyper-technical, but it would be nice if different weapons felt a little more distinct. If using a two-handed weapon feels heavy and powerful, while faster weapons feel more precise and reactive. Just small touches like that would make the act of fighting feel more physical and responsive. And honestly, part of combat improving will probably come naturally with the other pillars that we're working on. If character identity is stronger, combat starts to feel different depending on what you're playing. A stealth character approaches fights completely different than a battle mage or a heavily armored warrior. If exploration is stronger, you'll encounter enemies in more interesting situations instead of just entering generic rooms full of bandits. All of that feeds back into combat, because the goal isn't to turn the Elder Scrolls into a hardcore action game. The goal is to make combat feel like a natural extension of the world and the character that you built. It should be engaging enough that you enjoy doing it, but flexible enough that different playstyles actually feel viable. If they can find that balance, combat will support everything else the game is trying to do instead of just existing as something you tolerate between quests. And that leads pretty naturally into our final pillar, the stories they tell and the quests that carry you throughout the world, writing and quests. Alright, pillar 6 is writing and quests. And I want to be careful with how I frame this one, because I don't think the Elder Scrolls lives and dies by writing the way some RPGs do. Exploration is still the heart of these games. That's the thing that keeps people playing for hundreds of hours, wandering off in a random direction and finding something strange, getting pulled into situations that you didn't plan for. That's the magic. But writing and quests still matter, because they're what give those places contexts. When you walk into a cave or a ruin, the story attached to it is what turns it from another dungeon into something memorable. Skyrim actually did this pretty well in a lot of places. You'll find notes skeletons, environmental cues, little bits of storytelling that made it feel like something had happened before you arrived. Sometimes those stories were really small, whether it be a failed exploration or bandits that turn on each other. Those little stories are part of what makes exploration feel rewarding. Where Skyrim struggled a bit more was on some of the larger quest lines. A lot of them were good ideas that moved too quickly. You join in a faction and suddenly you were running it before you even had time to understand how it worked. The College of Winterhold is probably the most obvious example. You show up, do a handful of missions, and suddenly you're the Archmage. You never really truly felt like you earned it. For Elder Scrolls 6, I don't think the answer is to turn the game into some massive narrative epic where every questline is trying to compete with The Witcher or Baldur's Gate 3. That's not really what the Elder Scrolls is. But I do think that quests should feel like they breathe a little bit more. Let faction storylines unfold over time. Let the player spend time inside of these organizations before they suddenly become the leader of them, building relationships and letting the world react to what happens. Those questlines are a big part of how players interact with the setting. Another thing I think the Elder Scrolls does well and should keep doing is environmental storytelling. Some of the best moments in these games aren't even in dialogue. They're the things you piece together when you look around. A ruined campsite, a trail of bodies, or a journal left behind somewhere deep underground. Those little discoveries are what make the world feel alive and like they exist beyond the player. And honestly, that kind of storytelling fits Elder Scrolls better than huge walls of dialogue, which actually leads into something that Emil Pagliarulo said a while back, and it got a lot of attention. His comment about how Bethesda players would take the next great American novel and turn it into a paper airplane. And a lot of people got pretty upset about that. And I'm actually pretty in between. On one hand, it is a ridiculous thought to say that Bethesda fans wouldn't prefer better stories. But a lot of fans would just skip through the dialogue because exploration is the core of the games. On that note, I feel like the writing of the Elder Scrolls works best when it supports exploration instead of stopping it. Give us interesting characters, strong quest concepts, and factions that feel believable and rooted in the world. But let the player experience most of the story through action and discovery instead of long-winded speeches. And I think that balance is really important. If the writing gets too heavy, it slows the game down. And if it's too shallow, the world starts to feel forgettable. The sweet spot is somewhere in the middle. Stories that give meaning to places we explore without constantly pulling us away from the experience of exploring them. If the Elder Scrolls 6 can land in that space, the world will naturally start to produce memorable moments on its own. And honestly, that's what these games have always done best. Alright, so those are the 6 pillars of what I want in the Elder Scrolls 6. World design and setting, exploration, player agency and consequence, character identity, combat, and writing and quests. None of these things on their own make an Elder Scrolls game great. It's the way they all come together that makes the experience work. And that's why I'm hoping that Elder Scrolls gets them all right. But I'm curious what you all think. What's the one thing you absolutely need to see in the next Elder Scrolls game? If you could only pick one pillar that Bethesda has to nail, what would it be? Also, let me know what you want to see next on the channel. We've got a few directions we can go, so I'm always interested to see what people are actually excited about. If you enjoyed the video, drop a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and comment. It really does help the channel grow. And if you're interested in what we're working on ourselves, check out our game on Steam, Winterreach Emporium, the fantasy shop management game we're developing. It's set in a world inspired by a lot of the same fantasy vibes we were talking about today. You can wishlist it now on Steam, the link is in the description. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.